system often assumes that decisions, whether to testify, settle, or comply, are made rationally. But what if they're not? What if trauma, stress, or even lack of sleep is pushing legal actors and litigants toward choices that feel good in the moment, but create long-term damage? In this episode, we look at how emotional distress distorts decision-making in legal contexts and how psychological science might help us build legal technology that can recognize those distortions before they spiral. Dr. Karin Coifman, a clinical psychologist at Kent State University, has spent years studying how people behave under extreme stress. Her findings may have serious implications for how courts, law firms, and legal tech platforms interpret human behavior. In high conflict or trauma-driven cases like custody disputes, restraining order hearings, or post-incident intake, people sometimes make choices that don't make sense to an outside observer. But that's the point. These decisions aren't made from a place of clarity. They're made from a place of survival.
There's a lot of really good theory that would suggest that generally we are motivated to feel better, right? And that hedonic motivation, which is what we talk about a lot in my field, drives a lot of our behaviors and decision making. They tend to rely on behaviors that make you feel good in the short term, but then have long-term negative consequences, like binge eating, right? Or drinking alcohol, or avoiding something that would otherwise be good for you, right? And that's because those are, in some levels, easier choices to make when you have less resources. And by resources, I mean all kinds of things. You can think about it as like willpower or cognitive resources. There's lots of ways we characterize this. But when you are under stress, everybody has less resources. And if you feel bad, you're much more prone to engage in behaviors that provide short-term relief, but then often have long-term consequences.
Those short-term relief behaviors show up everywhere. Avoiding hearings, ignoring deadlines, lashing out at opposing parties, or dropping out of mediation. They may seem irrational, but from a brain wired to reduce pain, they're perfectly logical. We see it all the time in family law, criminal defense, and trauma litigation. The person who sabotages their own case. The survivor who disappears before court. The parent who gives up custody, not because they don't care, but because they can't cope. Coifman's NIH-funded research followed people in the aftermath of life-altering events, crashes, assaults, traumatic injuries, to see how they coped and how their decisions evolved over time. The results shed light on why some people recover and others spiral.
So I'm going to give you an example. Okay. So in this project that I talked about that was funded by NIH, we're just finishing up the data. We have some findings that are kind of consistent with things that we found in other samples and other projects, which is that when people are, and so this is a high stress environment, right? They've just had this terrible thing happen to them. They have this really significant physical injury. People had terrible things like amputations and from terrible car crashes and violence and lots of surgeries and bad stuff. Okay. So in this really high stress situation, if people were not feeling good, right, and they were motivated to feel better, which we naturally are as humans, this hedonic motivation is really powerful, they tend to rely on behaviors that make you feel good in the short term, but then have long-term negative consequences. Except if you happen to be a person who, under this stressful context, happens to have or be able to sustain, right, more resources, then actually you make a good choice. And in fact, you might make a choice to feel better using something that requires more motivation, like going for a walk or seeking support from someone or, meditating, right? Those are things that are actually harder to do in the moment because they take more to kind of get yourself to go do them. But like reaching for a pint of ice cream is a pretty low effort way to temporarily feel good, and eating ice cream temporarily makes you feel good. Like that's for sure true. So those kinds of things are really complicated, and some people tend to have more resources, but it's not just that. It's also some people tend to be able to access their resources more in times of stress. And so what we're trying to understand is why and who and how can we shore up somebody's resources so that even in these moments where they're under enormous amounts of pressure, they can still make a better choice to feel better because that circumstance is making them feel bad. But I do think that there are things that make people access kind of their maximum potential, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And these are actually really, really simple biological kinds of things. So, for example, if you sleep well, you tend to be able to access those resources more readily. But if your sleep is disrupted, and particularly persistently disrupted, it's harder and harder and harder to make those good choices. And this is just a fact, right?
Mhm.
Irrespective of where you start, if you have bad sleep, it is harder to generate the resources in the moment to motivate a good choice. And that's across the spectrum of good choices, right? Eating, sleeping, whatever. Um, so that's a simple thing. But the other thing is that sometimes people don't realize their habits. And so one of the things we work on in psychotherapy a lot with folks who struggle with perhaps making bad choices, behavioral choices, let's say eating or sleeping, bad choices, or using substances or even social interaction kinds of situations, is that we also try to build insight into these patterns of behavior. So for example, a lot of people don't know that if you sleep like garbage on, between Monday and Tuesday, that on Tuesday you're just that much more likely to make the easy rather than the good for you choice. And so building those relationships, and I know I'm focusing on sleep, but like there's like 1,000 other parameters that you could use. But in this case, it's pretty objective. Like a person could know if they sleep well or not well, and then they could know that they're more vulnerable to engaging in something they're trying to do less of.
Mm.
And that's a way, by building that insight and those tendencies, you can then kind of get the person to learn how to compensate. Right. So, oh, I woke up this morning and I feel like garbage because I slept like garbage. So I know it's going to be harder for me to motivate and go to the gym, or it's going to be harder for me to go out into the world and do this hard thing I'm working on. And so I need to do these extra things to make it more likely that I make that choice.
In other words, context matters. What looks like defiance or disengagement might simply be a sign of depleted capacity, limited emotional or cognitive bandwidth. Here's the opportunity. If emotional vulnerability leads to predictable behavior patterns, could legal technology detect those patterns early? Could triage tools, intelligent intake systems, or adaptive communication features respond to users under stress more appropriately? The idea isn't to replace judgment, but to augment it. Technology, when informed by science, can help flag distress, adapt workflows, and prevent small breakdowns from becoming big legal problems.
In my field, we're really struggling with a problem of a very, very high prevalence of mental distress and a very low level of resources available to people. This is a real, legitimate, like economic and health challenge in our country and across the world. And so there is a way that AI might be able to really help, particularly in terms of triaging or funneling people to the right kind of resource. Because not everybody has to see a therapist. There's lots of things that people can do to feel better, but it's very hard to unpack when you have these enormous masses of people in need and actually legitimately far too few people available to help them. It's a problem on college campuses in particular, but it's a problem everywhere all the time.
If emotion drives behavior and distress distorts decision-making, then the future of legal technology must account for that, not just to make smarter platforms, but to create fairer ones. Behavioral science is already shaping medicine, education, and finance. The legal system may be next, and the sooner it embraces the science of how people really function under pressure, the closer we get to building systems that don't just process cases, but understand people.